let's get to the counteroffensive now, because I was scouring the media, as I know you often do in your presentations, about the counteroffensive, and I found it interesting. It's both a contrast with a lot of continuity. And so at this moment, I'm just going to pull up a few articles. So here you have, let's say, the Financial Times, and the headline, which of course we live in an era where headline scrolling is pretty dominant, especially in the collective West, where the headline is very gloomy. The hard lessons from Ukraine's summer offensive. The country's military is enjoying some success, but it will be slow going and requires allies to increase ammunition supplies. We don't even really have to go further than that, because that's literally just the argument expanded. Saying that there have been slow but significant gains in the country in recent weeks. However, there are meager results, exposing divisions, Ukraine and the United States getting into spats, for example. And then
can you go up to the map, Danny?
Yes, here's the map.
Look at those arrows, and I mean,
right.
That's the map you show before it starts. Like, that's the direction you're going to go in, but they haven't gone anywhere, so that's still the map that they're showing for the offensive.
Yes, and this is that exact map, and this is where the United States is taking a lot of umbrage, is the fact that Ukraine has thrusted most of its forces at very particular points, and they want Ukraine to focus on the south, but there's too much investment in Bakhmut. In any event, as we continue, here Ukraine is getting mad because they think the U.S. doesn't understand their own territory. The U.S. is concerned about the rainy season coming up, or the cold season coming up, as being very wet in the fall. Ukraine says, no. But here it says, after early unsustainable losses, Ukraine pivoted back to a campaign of attrition. And I see this a lot, Brian. I definitely want your comment on it, where now they're framing the war of attrition as being in Ukraine's favor, which I seem to remember Russia actually employing a strategy of attrition and finding a lot of success in this. But in any event, they're talking about this new strategy as some success, but that there's a lot of misunderstanding between all sides, and that, of course, the conclusion is support has to be stepped up. But the mood is much more gloomy than, let's say, this article in CNN, which I found actually, it's a pretty nauseating read. So I don't even know if I suggest people read the whole thing. But Ukraine is actually making progress against Russia. So you have a more of a optimistic tone. But if you just go into this article...
Wait, just go back to the top image. Right. And I just want to point out that that logo right there, that is the Wolf's Angle, the modernized Wolf's Angle. Yes. That is a Nazi insignia that CNN just casually splashes on their website and doesn't explain to their readers what it is, and no one will know unless someone pointed it out. Please continue.
There it is. I just thought that's important. That's a good catch. That's a good catch. It's and it's not so small there, as you can see. It's pretty large. So here is Mr. Sebastian Roblin, a former Peace Corps, Georgetown University. If anyone knows anything about Georgetown, it is where the neocons go to get educated. Essentially, it's a huge, it's a huge factory for pumping out these kind of people. And so this article, I want to go, the whole thing is a diatribe. Really, you could see it as a diatribe against people like Brian Berletic. But really, he's talking more about the realists and those forces in the United States foreign policy establishment, which are not so keen, like General Mark Milley, for example, just going on forever and ever and ever with this conflict. And of course, the GOP. But here I highlighted that it's true that the Ukrainian counteroffensive debuted with conspicuous setbacks and hasn't advanced as much as hoped. Russia's military did correct some of these mistakes in 2022, and when Ukraine's newly Western trained and equipped but inexperienced brigades launched a counteroffensive in June, they discovered Russian minefields were too dense and deep to breach quickly enough to use mine-clearing vehicles before Russian drones, artillery, and attack helicopters could detect and target them. Above all, Ukraine didn't nearly have enough of these vehicles to absorb the losses. And then here again, this is the common theme. Ukraine's military switched to slower attrition warfare, which it was accustomed. Engineers carefully cleared lanes through vast minefields, and that Ukrainian troops have now managed to advance on an average of 700 to 1,200 meters every 5 days using these methods. And so at the end of the article, of course, this is a very predictable thing. While there's all this optimism, there's this huge acknowledgement that to give Ukraine the best shot at liberating its regions occupied by Russia in 2022, Washington and NATO need to work out multi-year plans to sustain military assistance. Above all, artillery systems, ammunitions, followed by air defenses, drones, and armed vehicles. As stores of easily donated equipment from the West dry up, new large-scale production and procurement orders funded by the U.S. and its allies must be stepped up. So, Brian, your reaction to this, because there's this optimism that Ukraine is making progress, and then at the end, there's multi-year plans for sustaining assistance and acknowledgments peppered throughout an analysis like this of here are the shortages, there's not enough weapons, there's been setbacks, but oh, look at this progress. So I'm confused because I haven't really seen many verified reports on major progress that this article is claiming, but also the suggestions and the conclusions kind of lend itself to an opposing, I think, viewpoint of, is this optimism even warranted? This seems like optimism kind of overshadowing reality.
It's people not wanting to acknowledge reality is what it is. They don't want to acknowledge that the offensive failed. They didn't want to acknowledge the people pointing out the factors before the offensive was even launched that guaranteed that it would fail, that there was no possible way for this to be a success. Again, no matter how much territory they managed to seize, especially at this point, but even before the offensive was launched, they would suffer far too many losses. They would be far too depleted at the end of the offensive for it to have had made any difference. Overall, it is an attritional conflict. It is a war of attrition. And so you're trading your army in for territory that is putting you one step closer to defeat, not victory. That was the problem that Ukraine had last fall, their offensive around Kharkov and Kherson. They shed off an entire army that the West helped them build up to take territory in Kharkov and around Kherson. They depleted their forces. They depleted their trained manpower, their equipment, their ammunition. And then they had to wait for NATO to send them another army's worth of equipment, weapons, ammunition, and to try to train up these new brigades that they were going to use for this offensive. And by the way, that's not enough time to train up a brigade out of thin air. You cannot do that. It could take years to build a real brigade, an effective brigade. It is not just 4,000 men running across the battlefield. There are different units within a brigade that need to be trained. You have entry-level troops. You have their leadership. There's multiple levels of leadership within a brigade that is around 4,000. You have different types of units, tanks, artillery, infantry, and they all have to not just be trained as individual soldiers and then as a unit, but also in combined arms warfare together as a brigade and then together with other elements within the Ukrainian armed forces. There was nowhere near enough time to do all of that. It was impossible. There is no way for the US and the rest of NATO to help Ukraine do this anytime in the near future. It is impossible. So they say multi-year commitment to do what? They're already trying to expand artillery ammunition. That is the one thing that they've committed to. And they say they will be making, I think, between 83 or 85,000 rounds per month, the United States. Maybe Europe will try to match that. And they say, well, the earliest 2025, but maybe somewhere around 2028. That's years from now. And that New York Times article, I'll read the headline so people can look it up on their own. Russia overcomes sanctions to expand missile production, officials say. And in this article, they admit that Russia is making around 2 million artillery shells right now every year. It's probably much more than that. But even if it is just 2 million rounds a year, that is more now that Russia is making than the US and Europe combined will be making if and when they finally expand production. So this notion that they're going to expand production with some sort of multi-year plan, that is a fantasy. That is a fantasy. It cannot be done. It will not happen. And because this is a war of attrition, that tells you what is going to happen in the future. So articles like this are an attempt to delay the inevitable, telling the public that this has failed. We remember the US media, the Western media, doing this in regards to Afghanistan, in regards to the proxy war in Syria, in Iraq, and everywhere else the US goes, all around the world. This is what they do, and this is what they're doing in Ukraine.
Yeah, and this, it seems to also negate, similar to, I think it's a good comparison as well, similar to in Afghanistan, where there was always a negation of the legitimacy of the Taliban and perhaps the ability of Taliban-led forces and others to fight back against the occupation. There's always like a negation that, this isn't serious. They're just terrorists. We're good. We can stabilize this government. And at the end, it was a pretty rapid deterioration. And now, in Ukraine, on these front lines and in the analysis of the counteroffensive, there is a real negation or an attempt to negate Russia. It blows my mind to flip. It's like this flip of things where at first, especially in the first 6 months to a year of this conflict, it was throw everything in, everything is, that is great. We're going to make huge gains there. Russia doesn't have a chance. Look at how many mistakes Russia is making. They've underestimated us. That was the narrative in the collective West. Now they're saying that Ukraine's strategy, which I don't think is a strategy, I think it's a response to the real conditions on the ground. The strategy of a war of attrition, it doesn't seem to favor Ukraine at all, and there's no attention to what could Russia do in the meantime if you have to plan years on out to achieve goals that are seemingly unachievable if they're going to take years and years to even attempt to actually successfully achieve. So what's your reaction to this? Because it does feel like Russia is still being treated as this bumbling kind of aggressor without any real attention to the reality on the ground here.
It's a very good point. The way Russia has been underestimated, and this is something the U.S. consistently does with all of its adversaries. It's doing it right now with China, if you can believe that. We hear, and even in that CNN article that you just went over, we see a lot of very flawed analysis, if it could even be called analysis. We're not even really sure if these people are genuinely trying to analyze things or if this is just propaganda that they're deliberately publishing to deceive the public. But there are severe misconceptions about Ukraine's fall offensive last year. They imagine as if this was, something that Ukraine did because it was, they were doing so well. We did such a good job arming them and equipping them. And in reality, Russia simply didn't have enough troops to cover Kharkov. They did not commit enough troops. It was a special military operation. It was not a full-scale invasion. And I don't know if you noticed this, Danny, but the Western media always does this, where every time they mention Russia's involvement in Ukraine, they always have to say full-scale invasion. That this phrase is always used. And it's almost as if they know that it isn't, but they are so desperate to convince you that it is, so they will say this. They also say unprovoked. They like to use that word all the time, unprovoked, when we all know that it most certainly was.
You wouldn't have to say it. Why do you have to say unprovoked exactly. over and over and over again? If you can say it once and hopefully it'll stick. But anyway, continue.
Exactly. So it is obviously propaganda that you're trying to drill into people's heads. So then there's the misconception that Russia thought they would just come in 3 days and take over all of Ukraine and subjugate Ukraine. We still hear U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken repeating this fallacy. It is completely false. And we know that it's false because we can see how the Russian military prepared itself. They prepared for years and years and years, probably since 2008, when NATO trained and armed Georgian forces attacked Russian forces. Russia saw that their military was inadequate, and so they endeavored to revitalize, reform, modernize their military, expand military industrial production. And from 2008 until 2022, and even up until now and well into the future, they continue doing this. They were prepared for a large-scale, protracted conflict. They had huge amounts of men, equipment, ammunition stockpiled for a very long-term conflict. That is why they still have the advantage on the battlefield right now. And this is why NATO collectively have run out of weapons, ran out of ammunition, because Russia was prepared for a long-term conflict and NATO was not. And so again, it's almost as if it's projection. Well, we thought it would be real quick. It turned out it's a long-term conflict, and that's something that Russia got wrong. Actually, they seem very well prepared for that. It seems like NATO is ill prepared for that. So it is an underestimation of Russia. The West continues to do this. We still see analysts and Western politicians acting as if, like you say, Russia is bumbling, when in fact it seems like it has a plan and it's patiently executing it. It's avoiding provocations, and it's going to continue grinding down Ukraine until it gets the results that it wants.
Yeah, and you mentioned the CNN article, but I actually want to pull up the Financial Times article one more time, because I think your point is well taken. And to be fair, I would say the Financial Times is even more reliable in their coverage of Ukraine than CNN, which is literally a propaganda mill. But Financial Times tries to speak to people in the big finance sector, in amongst the super wealthy, and protect their investments, so to speak. So here is as you said, there was a miscalculation, maybe a projection, that if Russia could be provoked in this conflict, it would fall quite quickly with the combination of pressures militarily, politically, and economically. Well, here is what they're saying now about the counteroffensive, that Ukraine's new strategy has had some success, but it will be slow going at best without a sudden Russian collapse. Crucially, it will be dependent on Ukraine's allies increasing production of ammunition, other equipment to sustain an attritional war. So now they kind of reveal it there, that this was there's hope of a Russian collapse, but now that is completely and utterly just out of the picture. And so now Ukraine has to, I think that's what they're really saying. That's what the neocons, the foreign policy, I was just trying to say is, yes, this is a war of attrition now, because the initial hope of Russia's collapse actually failed. That hope was never achievable in the first place. And now we're going with what is possible under what are inconvenient, if not unfavorable circumstances.
Well, again, that paragraph right there is telling you that Ukraine has lost. They lost because none of that is possible. Number one, they're not having any success. Russian defenses were built in layers specifically to give way to particularly powerful or numerous Ukrainian assaults. And that's exactly what Russian defenses are doing. They're working exactly as designed. So no, Ukraine is not making any gains. They have bled dry their offensive potential. They have committed all of their last reserves. All of the brigades that they prepared for this offensive have been committed to the fighting, and they still have not breached the first main Russian defensive line. And after that, there's several others they still have to breach. So they're not making any success. There's no progress. There's no success at all. They're taking these villages. They're pushing Russian forces back, but that is exactly how Russian defenses were designed. So that's one. Number two, yes, like you say, they all thought Russia would just collapse. It's a gas station with nukes masquerading as a country. They have said this over and over again. But as I've tried to explain in many of my videos, and many other analysts have pointed out, Russia has a very large industrial base. even compared to other Western nations, actually in many cases bigger. As Alexander Mikuris pointed out, that the steel production of Russia is comparable to the United States. So the US, a much larger economy, a much larger GDP, a larger population, but comparable steel production, gives you an idea of how large Russian industrial capacity is versus the size of its population in relation to other Western nations. So that's important to keep in mind, because industry is what actually creates the physical world that surrounds us and changes the physical world in ways you want it changed. Military power is a product of your industrial base, and it allows you to project your political will physically on, say, a battlefield. So that is a very important aspect that the West has neglected for decades. They have neglected their industry. The United States has sent it all to China. Now they're complaining they have no industry left. But even as they recognize that as a problem, they exclude it from their analysis of, say, the conflict in Ukraine and the impact of having shed their industrial capacity and trying to go up against a nation that still has their industrial capacity. This is a huge problem. So that whole paragraph tells you that Ukraine is going to lose. There's no way for them to win. Russia is not going to suddenly collapse. And I hate to keep bringing up Nazis, but that is exactly what Adolf Hitler said before he invaded Russia. It's a large structure, but it's all rotten. All we do is kick in the door, and the whole rotten thing will come collapsing down. I'm sure Victoria Nuland said something very similar, and that is not even nearly what has happened. Again, that New York Times article is admitting that Russia's military production has only increased since all of this began. How about U.S. military production or European production? How about the U.S. or European economy versus the Russian economy? So there's a lot of things that have blown back in their faces. There's many sayings about how dangerous ignorance is. So you just pick the one you like the best and apply it. And it turns out that those sayings are absolutely true.
Yes, indeed. And lastly, in terms of Ukraine losing, your last reaction to this counteroffensive, Zelensky is going on a charm offensive, as the collective West likes to call it, but it's increasingly a desperate one. And Politico is reported on Zelensky heading to New York this weekend. Well, actually early next week, from the 19th, I believe, the UN General Assembly, the 78th session is to be held. Zelensky will be there. And Politico says that Zelensky's heading to New York to court the rest of the world. This is quite interesting because this conflict has been going on for quite some time, Brian. To court the rest of the world now seems a little bit late. But as it says here, so we're going to just move through some highlights. Zelensky hopes to make his case both in a speech to the U.S. General Assembly and a blizzard of meetings with fellow leaders, including he will be meeting with Biden on the 21st in D.C., according to senior government officials familiar with the planning. But here is the crux of the matter. The effort faces serious challenges. Many of the countries that have avoided taking sides hail from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, often called the Global South, and they are loath to anger any world power if it could damage their own national interests. Even if they've rhetorically condemned the Kremlin's invasion, many haven't cut economic or diplomatic ties or enforced Western sanctions on Russia, allowing Moscow to keep cash flow. Ukrainian leaders believe they have to make their case. The Zelensky trip is part of a broader surge in Ukrainian diplomacy that has coincided with Kiev's counteroffensive against Russia. So, Ukrainians worry about a growing sense of global impatience. The realization is setting in that this will be a long war. And then they talk about how Zelensky actually hasn't done a lot of diplomacy, surprise, over the course of the conflict, but now has stepped up those efforts in recent months, especially in lieu of this counteroffensive. So, Brian, this feels like desperation. I don't even know if you could call it diplomacy. It feels more like an attempt to beat over the heads other countries around the world, an attempt to pull them away from Russia in a moment where that's obviously not going to happen. And so your reaction on on this so-called charm offensive and what it tells us, I think it tells us exactly what you said before, that this is a losing effort now, and the efforts are becoming more, the follow-up is becoming more desperate.
Why even bother at this point? Like you said, the conflict has been going on for so long. If he hasn't convinced all of these nations, he never will. There are really good reasons for these nations not siding with Ukraine, and they can pretend that it's because they're just trying to protect their interests and they don't want to make anyone angry. But the rest of the world can sense the waning West, its weakness, its growing. And a lot of these countries have gone along with the West, not because they wanted to, but because they have no choice. Now they have a choice. So they're all patiently waiting for the clock to run out. They see this conflict draining the West of its energy. It's laser focused on Ukraine, which means it's not meddling in their countries anymore. No one is in a rush to save Zelensky or to save the West and their proxy war in Ukraine. They're so out of touch with the reality. And who is he going to charm? He just called, his senior advisor just called Chinese people and Indian people low IQ. Here in Southeast Asia, it's a combination of Indian and Chinese heritage. Surely they're offended. So he just offended the vast majority of Eurasia between Russia and China, India, and everyone in between. He's insulted all of these people that now President Zelensky is going to try to charm. Who's going to fall for this and why?
Yeah, and you said it right. You said these
some
countries
also see American
yeah,
and Europe in decline.
like this is literally, I mean, this is the mainstream media, this is Politico admitting exactly as you mentioned that these countries, especially in the global south, especially in these areas, Africa, Asia, Latin America, this is what they see. It's exactly, you are correct. It says among African actors, at least part of the global south, there is an understanding that there's shifting there is something shifting about international affairs, and it is not in their interest to align themselves behind any party. In a word, they see a multipolar world, and Ukraine is certainly not part of that at the moment.
And a lot of these nations recognize the West's role in their problems developing. The West would like to imagine that these countries are just underdeveloped because of their own deficiencies. But no, it was because they've been preyed on for generations by the collective West, the European colonial powers, and then the United States, who was the successor of all of these empires and continues modern day imperialism to this day. So they are very well aware of this. And like I said, why would they side with Ukraine? And considering the trouble, even if they wanted to, they can see that Ukraine has lost. There's nothing they can do to change that. So why would they allow themselves to be recruited onto the losing side of a conflict? It makes no sense. No matter which way you cut it, it makes absolutely no sense.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.